What if what goes on behind the facade of this perfect educator is actually something completely different? So what I want to propose in this little talk is that all these ideal attributes that we see of the perfect educator, that we should possibly sometimes explode them and instead consider completely different teaching strategies, which might sound very, very unlikely and impractical and ridiculous, but perhaps in the next couple of minutes, I might be able to convince you to at least consider them. So let's start with the happiest one, anger. So I think that losing my temper in front of a classroom is probably the worst thing that could happen to me, right? I want to stay calm. If I already lose my temper, it should be in a positive way, like, that was such an amazing essay, something like that, right? But not to get angry, that's unprofessional. But what about when anger, actually, when it comes to me as an art historian, what if that is actually a perfect gateway to one of the first fundamental driving forces between art? We talked about love and hate before. So, for instance, here we have a very happy image of the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. Art history is full of seething images of death, violence, and destruction. And of course, they are not purely driven by anger. They are much more complex than that. But sometimes allowing yourself to get into that emotion might be actually a very useful tool. So how do you do this practically? You could, for instance, ask your students, what art do you absolutely hate? What is your least favorite book? Who really pisses you off? And sometimes, interestingly enough, by polarizing a discussion, sometimes you leave more room to be more nuanced. I've noticed this myself when I whine about somebody and I really bitch about them, like, oh, she's so awful, she really gets on my nerves. At some point, there's this room in my head which is like, actually, there's also other aspects. Now, in art history, we are all about creation, right? So destruction is very often seen as the polar opposite of creation. But at the same time, perhaps you could argue that actually destruction could be a really, really good and effective teaching strategy. Actually, there have been several artists who used destruction as an actual artistic strategy. So on the left, we have Yves Klein, who's painting with fire, so burning the canvas, and the fire is actually leaving a trace. And on the right, which is one of my favorite examples of the paradox of destruction and creativity, is an artist called Gustav Metzger, who's painting with acid. So the moment the paint of the acid hits the canvas, it eats the canvas, and the painting's gone. These are two examples of, famous artists who did it, but let's think about our childhood. Let's think about the spontaneity that we had before we were afraid of making a silly and ugly drawing. Let's think about the spontaneity of making stuff of Play-Doh that we cannot keep forever. Perhaps sometimes destruction is something that is really, really liberating. And perhaps we should also accept that we as scholars, our ideas change. Sometimes we let things go, and that's fine. We don't have to set everything in stone. Mistakes can also be very satisfying. Sometimes perfection actually sucks, like in this video, which I think is very satisfying to watch. Just wait for it. Here you go. There's a cappuccino. So sometimes taking your students with you on this sort of, course towards wonder and estrangement and not understanding can sometimes be very useful. So rather than being afraid of question marks, perhaps all these strategies that I was just talking about, anger, destruction, all these things that lead to estrangement and not actually knowing, is something that we ultimately would have to start to love. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it all about overcoming those emotions at the end, or is it okay to leave this dissonance open? Which means not to necessarily have to overcome bias, not to have to overcome dissonance.
I think the idea that we can completely overcome them is an illusion anyway. And I think the best way to definitely overcome bias is to openly talk about your bias, because we know this, right, about microaggressions, about the Me Too movement, about subtle racism. When we don't talk about these things, when we don't really critically examine ourselves and share our bias because we're afraid of being shamed or we are afraid of hating ourselves, we will never root them out.
Yeah, I like the idea or your example of having to deal with Celan, for example, and having this bias about his poetry, which I can totally understand. But at the same time, that means you, for example, if you have this as your motivation, hatred towards this kind of poetry, you still intellectually engage. It doesn't mean you have to, at the very end, love this guy, right, or his poetry. It can still be, okay, no, I was right. I don't like it, but nonetheless, I engaged in an intellectual way.